Hello everyone, this is Mr. McIntosh, and today's video will start off by recapping the week 2 assignments in our new unit, Media Literacy, and we'll go over how to complete week 3's assignments. So we started this new unit on media literacy, and the idea is that you'll be able to, by the end of the unit, critically consume media. So more thoroughly analyze and interpret all the different messages that you see on a daily basis, whether they're from videos, from traditional news sources, from social media, radio, print, advertisements, TV shows, video games, movies, all that counts as media. And media literacy is just a critical interpretation of that. So we started off with our opinionaire, which is this handout right here. You agreed and disagreed with a few statements. You wrote down where you got your news sources, so hopefully you got to think about that and were reflective about where you're getting your news from. There's a spot for bias to put the definition into your own words, and then you chose one of those statements from the opinionaire statements section, and you explained it in a little bit more detail. The opinion part, obviously, that is going to be your opinion, and there aren't really any correct answers to it as long as you're justifying your opinion logically and with reason. In terms of bias, so I imagine you came up with lots of different interpretations here. I would say a common error that I think students have is conflating or confusing bias with mere opinion. So to just have an opinion on a subject doesn't necessarily mean that you're biased or that you have a bias about a particular subject. Really, bias is when you have this systemic, underlying, consistent slant or lean or a certain interpretation or perspective in your writing or your media production. So it's not just, oh, I have this opinion on gun control or abortion. It's more so everything you produce skews a certain way or only represents one perspective and has a strong opinion time and time again in sort of an unfair way. So that is, I think you've probably heard the term bias before, but that's probably the most commonly seen misconception that I come across during this unit. The other portion of last week's lesson was the media literacy notes, which was a huge section of notes here. Basically, it covers almost every term or concept that we're going to be examining for this particular unit. It starts off with the core concepts of media, so the ideas that messages are constructed, right? People pay a lot of money in order to construct well thought out messages in order to influence the public. It's not just like a computer algorithm is designing media. It's humans with motives, with interests in mind when they're paying money to have these ads and pieces of media developed. And the second core concept that people experience messages differently. So based on your age or your education or your race or your background or your geographic location, you might see the same ad, the same commercial as someone else, the same movie as someone else, and internalize it very differently based on your own personal experiences. And media creators are aware of this, so they construct their messages with a lot of diligence. And lastly, most, although not necessarily all, media messages are created for power or for money. So keep in mind that news companies are businesses, right? They have a goal of profit. They have a goal of increasing revenue share. They want to expand their business. This doesn't mean that they can't be trusted, but it is something you should keep in mind when studying the media. Other things to keep in mind when studying the media, there's these 4 kind of core questions, we'll call them. So think about who made this media message. Why did they create the message? Why do they want me to be seeing this message right now? Because they've likely paid someone to create this message and paid for me to be able to see this message. Think about who they're targeting. in this media message, and how do they tailor their message to that particular audience, whether it's a specific age or gender or race or geographic region, etc. What is the message? So what idea do they want me to come away with after having viewed this particular media message? And is it credible? Can I trust it? Do I believe what they're saying in this message? Here we looked at two Newsweek articles, shots from the title pages, and you can see a certain political slant in comparing these two different covers. Right? There's a lot of different things you can pick apart here. The expressions of the two men, the fact that Obama has a well-knotted tie, whereas Romney has his button undone at the top by his neck there. Then you can look at their facial expressions. Obama is much more stoic than Mitt Romney here, who has this kind of awkward laugh, grin, with an unflattering kind of double chin going on here. The headlines, the wimp factor, we see wimp in big words here. Obviously not very pro-Romney, whereas this one is definitely pro-Obama. Why are Obama's critics so dumb? And lastly, another thing to point out is the title itself here, right? We have, oh, hey Scout, clapping around on the hardwood floor. We have the Newsweek title at the top, whereas Obama's face is literally kind of coming off of the page. He's blocking the Newsweek title at the top of the article here. And we kind of dove into gender bias and political bias here, looking at some data. And there's a few kind of key takeaways that you should have from this data set here. So first of all, this is a relatively difficult piece of data to analyze here. But the data seems to suggest, and notice that I use the word here, seems to suggest, not the data says that or the data proves that, but the data seems to suggest that there is some sort of gender bias within the media, because as we can see, during this particular election cycle, which was the 2012 election cycle, when it came to who was quoted about women's issues in the print media, we see a slant toward men being quoted more often than women. In addition to that, we can see in the newspapers, in the media companies at large, and in the TV stations in particular, the same kind of pattern. And then at the bottom is kind of in print versus on television. So, something to keep in mind here. Sorry, I had to keep the dog out of the room. Something to keep in mind here is a few different items, right? First of all, can we trust the source? Can we trust the data? So some things to consider about maybe what wasn't revealed or what wasn't covered is what these people are actually saying about women's issues in the print media, right? Maybe it's men who are being quoted more often, but they're saying pro-women things. We don't know what the content of what they're saying is, so that is an important piece of information that's been left out here. We also don't know how this particular organization chose its media stations to analyze. So maybe they have chosen stations that they know will give them a certain desired results, or maybe they've been chosen at random, or maybe they've just the top rated TV shows. We don't know that piece of information. We also don't know if this particular piece of information is more so a reflection of society, and that maybe there are more men, for instance, in certain industries, and therefore it's a representative number being quoted, or maybe the media is quoting men more often than they actually appear in these organizations, and therefore is exuding a lot of bias. Without all that information, it's very hard to come to a clear result. So just keep that information in mind. Always ask yourself when you see data, oh, what could be missing here? Am I seeing the full picture? Can I trust the source? Can I trust the data? Right? So always have these critical questions in mind. There's another section about correlation and causation, which I think is a fascinating concept when it comes to data. Um, if you figured out the answer here, good job. The answer, to kind of clear things up here, is that there are more deaths due to drowning the more ice cream is sold because it's summertime, right? In the summertime, people drown more. In the summertime, people eat more ice cream, at least in our hemisphere. And you don't want to conflate or confuse correlation and causation, right? Just because one thing increases as another thing increases doesn't mean that necessarily that one of those things is causing the other thing. Maybe they're just related to a third item that's causing both. Another quick example is shoe size and vocabulary, right? The larger your shoe size, the more expansive your vocabulary is. That's not because having big feet makes you smarter or makes you memorize more words. It's because you grow older, right? You have larger shoes as you're growing, and your brain's also developing more as you're growing and getting older. There's some great examples here of misleading statistics. Here, I'll just run by a couple of these real quick. Only 23% of Americans vote. You don't know whether that takes into account people who are just of voting age. There's maybe it's 23% of all Americans. Maybe it's 23% of people who are eligible to vote. So watch out for those statistics. Self-selection bias for surveys. So when like companies hand out surveys and they say, oh, X amount of people responded this way in a survey, always keep in mind that the people who are responding in those surveys are seeking out those surveys. It's not like they're just randomized and everyone is forced to do it, so therefore you have an accurate number or representation. Maybe your data skews a certain way only because it's people who actively seeked out that particular survey or chose to put their time in and respond to that survey. So and therefore they have more care about that topic, more concern about that topic, and that's why the results look a certain way. 88 guns for every 100 Americans makes you think, kind of as your gut reaction, oh, that means 88 out of every 100 people own guns, or 88% of Americans own guns. But of course, that's not necessarily the case. Maybe the people who do own guns own multiple guns, so that the data is skewed and not necessarily what it looks like at first glance. College acceptance rates can be a little bit misleading because, for instance, you see, oh, Harvard has this acceptance rate, or another school has this acceptance rate, but what those acceptance rates don't take into account is people who actively choose not to apply to that college because they don't think that they'll get in. So maybe you see like a really prestigious school actually has a much higher acceptance rate than you think. Well, that might not be because they have lower standards. Maybe it's because a lot of people choose not to apply because they don't think that they'll get in. And then another great example is Sweden and their sexual assault and rape statistics. So a lot of people like to tout that, oh, Sweden has the highest rape statistics in the world. What's going on there? And you think, kind of your gut reaction again, oh, maybe they have the most people who are raping other people, or maybe there's something wrong with their society. They're overly sexually active, or they assault everyone all the time. But also keep in mind, maybe Sweden has the highest number of reported rapes because they have the best reporting system, right? People feel the most comfortable there to speak up because they know they'll be supported when they do. So always when you see statistics, keep in mind, is there something more to the picture that I'm not seeing that's being left out? And then there's some kind of beware of items here. Free trials, typically how that works is you get a free month, and then automatically after that they start billing you unless you actively cancel it. Made with is a very misleading term in the food industry, because you could say, oh, this burrito is made with 100% grass-fed organic beef. And maybe it's the case that 1% of the meat that they use in that burrito is 100% grass fed organic beef. Made with doesn't mean made exclusively with or made only with. It just means that's one part of the overall ingredients. And same with the term all natural. It legally pretty much means nothing. Anyone can say that any product is all natural, and there's not, like, as far as I know, at least some sort of certification process to get that label on your food. And then BOGO, or buy one, get one. This can be a little bit misleading at times. You tend to think, oh, buy one, get one free, but sometimes it's just buy one, get one 50% off or 25% off, and you don't realize it until you're up at the register. A few other items here. So bias tools, for instance, we talked about framing and sound bites. Framing is when you present an argument in a certain way, even though it might seem like a very different argument than another news company, for instance, is providing. You still have the same facts, but by framing it a certain way, you can really change or influence your viewers' perspectives about it, as illustrated in this frozen yogurt cartoon here. And then sound bites, that's a term that we'll be using throughout the unit. There's an example of framing in action where we looked at some photos here, and just think about, what photos the media company is choosing when they portray a certain event or a certain story. So are they picking photos that flatter someone, that make them look good, that make them look like an upstanding citizen, or are they choosing unflattering images that try to paint them in a certain light? There's a little section about satire. That's hopefully a review for you, so I won't spend too much time there. Media gatekeepers. So keep in mind that there's an infinite number of news stories that could be going on at any given time period, but the ones that we see are chosen, they're curated by someone, and that means they choose what you are seeing, and they also choose what you are not seeing. So one way that we can combat gatekeeping is to tune into multiple different news stations to get our news from a wide variety of sources. The wider, the better. Hard news and soft news. That one's relatively straightforward. Soft news is your human interest pieces, your usually emotional pieces. It doesn't really matter when it happens, it's more so the emotional impact that's important here. And then hard news, these are your fact-based accounts, your live, your local, your late-breaking types of news. And then there's some examples of each of those two. And then there's kind of this like alternative advertising that is becoming more popular in the viral age. Product placements, I'm sure you're familiar with this. I'm sure you've seen it in TV shows, movies, in Instagram posts, etc. And then another one is staged or fake viral videos. So there's two examples here. This one is a guy doing tape measure tricks on the construction site, but really you see this window company's logo in the background in a bunch of different scenes. So there's been some speculation that it's staged, as well as Ellen's Oscar selfie in 2014, some speculation that it has potentially been staged so that she can advertise her phone there. All right, and then moving on to this current week. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into bias. There's a really interesting polarization, political bias quiz that you can take. The instructions are on here, so check that out, and then just jot down a couple reactions using these bullet points to guide you. And there's kind of a little workshop on net neutrality. So you're going to explore that on your own, and then we'll come back next week or after next week, because next week's spring break, and then we'll talk about what net neutrality is, what it means for you, how it could shape kind of the landscape of the internet in the near or far future. And then in other terms for next week, let me pop to the slide real quick. So we got the recap we're doing right now, net neutrality, political bias. Oh yes, and then the last thing is the discussion board. So on Canvas, there's a discussion. It's the only one up there right now. It's called Media One. The instructions are inside. Just make sure that you post your first post by Wednesday, so that by Friday or the close of the week before spring break, you can respond to someone else's post, right? If everyone waits until Friday, you won't have time, or there won't be available posts to respond to someone else's. So you're doing one post by Wednesday, that's explained here in the discussion, and then by Friday you're responding to one other person's post of your choosing, and I'll be on the message board, you know, responding to people's posts as they post on there. In other news, we should be getting some updates on the fourth quarter about, by email on the fourth quarter and about grading. So look for those. I'll keep you posted as soon as I hear more information. Hopefully we'll have more info from the county by Wednesday, and then even more by the end of spring break, so that we know exactly what fourth quarter looks like when we come back from spring break. Other than that, that's about all I have. Shoot me an email if you have any questions. Email address is christopher.mcintosh@apsva.us, or you can use the Canvas email tool. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next week.